The chill of a Tuesday morning always seems to bite a little harder when it carries the weight of a betrayal you saw coming from miles away. It was exactly 8:14 when the screen of my phone lit up, flashing the name of my eldest son. I didn't rush to answer it. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, looking out at the frost-covered porch of a property he assumed he had already stripped from my grasp. He was drastically mistaken. When I finally pressed the button and brought the receiver to my ear, his voice cut through the quiet room, stripped of any hesitation. He told me that a final executive decision had been reached, that the lakeside property was officially going on the market, and that I needed to pack up my belongings and vacate the premises by the first of the month. Let me pause here to introduce myself properly. My name is Arthur Vance. I am 74 years old, a retired structural architect, and a father to two grown men whom I raised with the very strength of these calloused hands. Back in the early 80s, the same year I married my beautiful late wife, Martha, we relocated to a quiet, scenic town in western Montana called Bitterroot. We bought a modest, traditional home nestled along Foothill Pass, poured our hearts into raising our boys there, buried a loyal golden retriever named Buster in the shade of the backyard pines, and successfully built the kind of peaceful existence that most people spend their entire lifetimes chasing. A quiet, honest life that belonged completely to us. Yet, this narrative isn't actually about that family home. This is a story centered around two entirely different lakes, two separate waterfront properties, and a greedy son who moved entirely too fast, completely forgetting that his father didn't just construct buildings, he meticulously blueprinted every single move. The first waterfront property, the iconic family cabin that everyone in our social circle knew inside and out, was positioned right on the pristine shores of Swan Lake. It sat roughly 20 miles northwest of Bitterroot, just past the old limestone quarry off State Route 12. I originally purchased that untouched plot of land decades ago for a mere $35,000, an amount that felt like an absolute fortune at the time, like wagering my entire financial future on a whim. Martha honestly believed I had completely lost my mind. I remember looking her straight in the eyes and telling her to just give it 20 years. She simply smiled, rolled her eyes affectionately, and handed me a homemade sandwich. That was true, unconditional love. I constructed every single square inch of that cabin with my own two hands over the span of 3 consecutive summers. My oldest boy, Logan, was just 10 during that first summer of construction, while my youngest, Tyler, was 7. Over the years, the Swan Lake cabin transformed into our absolute family anchor. It was the setting for every single 4th of July barbecue, the opening morning of every hunting season, every major graduation milestone, and every milestone birthday that required a little room to breathe. When Martha fell deeply ill a decade ago, we chose to spend her final, vibrant summer right there on the water. Logan and Tyler would make the drive up to join us every single weekend. We would sit together on the edge of the wooden dock, rarely speaking a word. We didn't need to. The silence was enough. When she passed away the following year, that cabin transformed into a sacred sanctuary for me, a place where the gentle ripples of the water still echoed her laughter. What I never revealed to my sons, what I kept entirely to myself, was that exactly 6 months after we laid their mother to rest, I quietly purchased a second piece of land. But we will get to that shortly. By the time the calendar flipped to recent years, Logan had reached 39. He had one messy divorce behind him and was newly remarried to a woman named Vanessa, who possessed an incredibly sharp appetite for the finer things in life, and a profound talent for spending money that had not yet been deposited into their bank account. Then there was Tyler, my 36-year-old. Tyler was a genuinely good-natured kid, but far softer around the edges than his older brother. He was the classic type of man who simply went along with whatever plan was laid out before him, purely because the friction of a disagreement made his stomach churn. I want to be entirely transparent here. I loved my sons. I loved them with the fierce, protective devotion you reserve for something you built up from absolutely nothing. But over the passing seasons, I had watched Logan shift, mutating into someone else entirely. It happened slowly, the exact way rust slowly compromises iron structure. You don't notice the microscopic flakes at first until the entire integrity of the frame is completely ruined. He began bringing up our family assets during Thanksgiving dinner. He would inquire about my long-term financial plans with a sharp, artificial enthusiasm that always felt rehearsed. Step by step, he would steer casual Sunday conversations toward my land holdings like a man who had already calculated the exact net worth of the inheritance. I registered every single hint, but I chose to keep my mouth shut and observe. That cool November morning, the air was crisp enough to demand a heavy canvas jacket. It was one of those classic mountain mornings where a dense, heavy fog hovers over the valleys like it owns the place. My smartphone had already delivered its devastating blow at 8:14 in the morning. But what I haven't fully detailed yet is the sequence of events that actually set that phone call in motion. It truly began 2 days prior, on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Logan called me out of the blue, and the moment I answered, his voice carried that specific, overly cautious tone. The artificial, rehearsed cadence a person uses when they are about to execute a speech they've been practicing in front of a mirror all morning. He started with a casual greeting, but it was entirely too casual for a Sunday. I took a slow sip of my drink and noted the early hour. He cleared his throat nervously. That specific throat clear was an old habit. I had recognized that exact sound since he was 16 years old and trying to figure out how to confess he'd dented the family truck. He told me that he and Tyler had been doing some serious thinking. I leaned back, bracing myself, and simply asked what they were thinking about. He hesitated before dropping the bomb. They wanted to discuss the Swan Lake cabin. I placed my coffee mug down on the wooden counter, completely unhurried, and asked him to clarify exactly what he meant. He sighed, reminding me that I was 74, spending most of my weekends completely isolated up in the mountains, and pointed out that the local property taxes were climbing, while the general upkeep was becoming a burden. He even went so far as to ask when I had last replaced the decaying timber sections on the western side of the boat dock. I informed him flatly that I had completely rebuilt it the previous spring. My voice remained entirely level, stripped of all emotion, as I told him to stop dancing around the issue and say exactly what was on his mind. Another sharp throat clear echoed through the line. He finally admitted that both he and Tyler believed it was the correct time to put the property on the market. He told me it was simply a matter of making the smart financial move, claiming the real estate market in that specific region was completely unprecedented. He casually threw out the fact that they had already brought a local real estate agent, a man named Marcus Vance out of Missoula, up to inspect the place. And Marcus estimated they could easily secure $380,000, maybe even $400,000 for the property. I repeated his words slowly, letting the weight of them sink into the line, asking him exactly when he had taken it upon himself to involve an agent. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the phone. Logan stammered slightly, insisting they merely wanted to gather all the necessary data beforehand so they could present me with the complete financial breakdown. My own son had gone behind my back to bring an outsider onto my land before he ever bothered to ask for my blessing. I let that reality sink in deep before asking if Tyler was genuinely on board with the plan. Logan instantly assured me they were completely aligned, then shuffled the phone over to his brother. Tyler's voice came through much quieter, instantly laced with an apologetic tone before he even completed a full sentence. I cut straight to the point, asking my youngest if this was truly his design. He hedged, claiming they had simply evaluated the scenario together. I told him that wasn't an answer to my question. After an agonizingly long pause, Tyler admitted that Logan had initiated the conversation, but maintained that from a purely financial perspective, the move made sense. I picked my coffee mug back up, entirely detached, and told them I had heard more than enough. Logan tried to interject, pleading with me not to shut down, claiming they were only looking out for my best interests. I told him I would contact them later and hung up the phone. I sat motionless on that porch for 40 minutes, surrounded by nothing but a solitary crow and the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that physically presses down on your chest. Was I angry in that moment? Not yet. Was I deeply wounded? I was completely shattered. At 74 years old, my own flesh and blood had circumvented me, retained an agent, and decided the ultimate fate of a structure I had built with the sweat of my own brow. But there is a distinct truth about reaching your mid-70s that caught me by surprise. You stop reacting impulsively, and you begin responding strategically. There is a massive gulf between the two. I stepped back inside the kitchen, brewed a fresh cup of coffee I didn't even want, sat down at the table on Foothill Pass, and opened the very bottom cabinet drawer, the one Martha used to refer to as my war room, because nothing light-hearted or trivial ever lived inside it. I reached in and pulled out a single, thick folder. Inside rested a property deed, but it wasn't the document for Swan Lake. The boys were fully aware of that one. This specific deed listed an entirely different address, a completely separate body of water, and an entirely different chapter of my life. I reviewed the legal descriptions slowly, despite knowing them completely by heart, and allowed myself to smile for the very first time all day. 2 mornings later, that 8:14 phone call arrived. Logan's voice was completely steady, projecting the absolute certainty of a man who believed he had already won the match. He informed me they were officially moving forward with listing the property, that the paperwork with Marcus was already finalized, and that I needed to clear my things out of Swan Lake by the end of the month because they were executing the sale with or without my cooperation. I let the silence stretch out between us just long enough to breed pure discomfort before asking him a simple question. Logan, which specific cabin do you think I am sitting in right now? There is a specific variety of silence that isn't empty at all. It's completely pressurized, like the held breath in the cabin of a vehicle a split second before impact, or the tense 3 seconds that hang between a flash of lightning and a crack of thunder when you're trying to gauge just how dangerously close the storm is about to hit. That was the exact brand of silence Logan handed me after I questioned him about my actual location. I counted the beats in my head. 1, 2, 3. Finally, he stammered, asking what I meant, asserting that I was obviously sitting at the Swan Lake property. I told him flatly that I hadn't said that at all. He demanded to know where I was then. I told him I was exactly where I belonged, leaning back into the sturdy frame of my chair. The old wood gave a familiar creak, the comfortable, unhurried sound of something settled and permanent. I told him to go right ahead and put Swan Lake on the market with his agent, Marcus Vance out of Missoula, and to execute whatever plans they had lined up. Logan grew frustrated, telling me I wasn't making any sense, but I corrected him, stating that I made perfect sense. He was simply out of the habit of listening to anything I had to say. I told him we would speak again soon and cut the connection, leaving him to stew in his own confusion. Now, it's time to reveal the truth about that second waterfront property, because this is the exact coordinates where the entire trajectory of this story shifts completely. Back in the spring of 2016, exactly half a year after I laid Martha to rest, when the weight of the grief was still fresh enough to taste at the back of my throat, I decided to take a long drive. I didn't program a destination into the dashboard. It was just me, a full tank of fuel, and my truck, watching the mountain landscape do exactly what it does in the early weeks of spring, looking stunningly beautiful and completely miserable, all at the exact same time. I ended up driving roughly 45 miles northeast of Bitterroot, far past the outskirts of Seeley Lake, right down a stretch of county road where the Douglas firs and ponderosa pines grow so thick and towering that they completely block out the late afternoon sun. I found myself parked at the edge of a pristine body of water called Flathead Oasis. It was notably smaller than Swan Lake, infinitely quieter, the exact kind of hidden gem that never shows up in tourism brochures because the select few people who actually know it exists prefer to keep it that way. Right there on the waterline, a piece of land was listed for sale. It was a spacious corner lot that sat significantly elevated above the high water mark, an architectural detail that any competent structural engineer will tell you matters far more than the average buyer ever realizes. The building constructed on that land wasn't a standard rustic cabin. It was a magnificent sweeping lodge. It featured 3 expansive bedrooms, a towering floor-to-ceiling riverstone fireplace, and a massive wraparound cedar deck oriented perfectly toward the west, meaning every single evening offered an unobstructed view of the mountain sunset. I finalized the purchase in April of 2016 for $260,000. Martha and I had been disciplined savers throughout our entire marriage. We drove reliable pre-owned trucks and never once signed our names to a purchase we couldn't completely cover in cash right then and there. That was our foundational philosophy. Logan always viewed that mindset as ancient and obsolete, but Logan had a lot of opinions about things he hadn't built himself. The moment the title was cleared, I placed the Flathead Oasis Lodge inside an ironclad, irrevocable trust, officially registering it as the Martha Vance Family Trust, with myself designated as the sole lifetime beneficiary. A completely independent estate attorney operating out of Helena, entirely unconnected to anyone my family had ever done business with, drafted and processed every single legal document. I shared the existence of that property with exactly one living soul on this earth. It wasn't Logan, and it wasn't Tyler. It was my oldest friend, Walter Briggs, a retired county records clerk who was 68 years old at the time. Walter understood land documents and property titles the way some men memorize scripture. He knew every chapter, every verse, and every legal consequence. Walter guarded my secret faithfully for 7 consecutive years, never once asking for an explanation. That is the exact definition of what a true friend looks like. Meanwhile, my sons spent those exact same 7 years driving up to the Swan Lake cabin, constantly probing about my long-term arrangements and eyeing the property like it was a financial inheritance they were already legally entitled to collect. Completely oblivious to the fact that the true prize was sitting 45 miles away on the shores of Flathead Oasis, quiet, patient, and waiting, just like me. The public listing went live on a Wednesday afternoon. I knew the exact moment it happened, because Walter called my line, his voice carrying that specific, heavy resonance that instantly tells you to steel yourself. He informed me that the Swan Lake cabin had just officially populated on the regional real estate network, documented under Logan's name as a designated co-owner, with a firm asking price of $390,000. I let out a long, slow breath, asking how quickly the market was moving. Walter confirmed they were already fielding immediate requests for walkthroughs, noting that the local market was incredibly aggressive and predicting that the agent, Marcus Vance, could easily lock down a buyer within 3 weeks. I told Walter to simply let the clock run out on them. He hesitated, asking if I was entirely certain of that strategy, and I reassured him completely. He fell silent for a beat, before remarking that I could be a remarkably cold man when I wanted to be. But I corrected him, stating that I was simply a thoroughly prepared man. There is a vast distinction between the two. I need to pause the narrative here to highlight an incredibly vital piece of information that Logan completely failed to comprehend, a reality that neither of my sons had bothered to investigate. Yes, my name was stamped clearly on the original Swan Lake deed as a co-owner alongside the boys, a specific legal arrangement I had established years prior under the assumption that it would streamline the eventual transition of the estate. What I had completely omitted from our family discussions, however, was a fundamental rule of property law in our jurisdiction. Co-ownership on a real estate deed does not grant a single individual the unilateral authority to execute a binding sale. To successfully transfer a title, the law demands the verified signatures of every single party listed on the deed. Every single one, which explicitly included me. The real estate agent out of Missoula either possessed a severe lack of professional training or simply neglected to perform his due diligence. He blindly accepted Logan's verbal assurance that the entire family was in complete agreement, rushed the listing onto the public market, opened the doors for private viewings, and successfully generated a formal, binding contract within 18 days. The prospective buyers were a corporate couple hailing from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, a man named Harrison Marsh and his wife, Clara. They were mid-40s professionals actively searching for a premium Montana waterfront property to escape to on weekends. They were likely perfectly respectable individuals who had simply walked headfirst into the completely wrong real estate transaction. Their formal offer materialized at $382,000. The moment the paperwork cleared his inbox, Logan contacted me, practically radiating a frantic energy through the speaker. He shouted that they had secured a phenomenal offer of $382,000, repeating the massive number twice as if I hadn't heard him the first time. I told him flatly that I heard the figure perfectly. He stuttered slightly, tracking into a sudden hesitation as he cleared his throat, the exact tone of a man realizing he has walked into a room that is configured entirely different than he anticipated. He told me they needed my signature on a few closing forms, downplaying it as a minor, meaningless formality because of my co-owner status. I let his explanation hang in the air for a long moment, allowing him to listen to the echo of his own desperation. I asked him if he remembered the specific question I had posed on the phone the previous week, regarding which cabin he assumed I was calling him from. Logan snapped back, asking what that detail could possibly have to do with the current situation. I informed him that it had everything to do with absolutely everything, and told him I would provide my final response on Thursday, knowing full well the buyers required a binding answer by that afternoon. When Thursday arrived, I made the drive out to Helena for an 11 o'clock appointment with my dedicated estate attorney, Javier Castillo. Javier was 49, a sharp, third-generation professional, possessing the absolute most brilliant real estate mind in the region, and he was a man who appreciated a perfectly executed legal maneuver the way some people appreciate fine theater. I laid the entire scenario across the polished wood of his conference table. The unapproved listing, the written offer, Logan's demanding phone calls, and the exact structural framework of the original deed. Javier leaned deep into his leather chair, steepling his fingers, staring across the table at me with the precise focus of a grand master calculating a board 3 moves away from an absolute checkmate. He spoke slowly, confirming that they had marketed a piece of real estate they possessed zero legal authority to sell without my signature, and that a buyer was currently holding a contract for $382,000, waiting for a closing. I confirmed every point. He noted that my son had classified this critical legal requirement as a mere formality, a detail that brought a tiny, razor-sharp smile to his face. Then we verified the status of the Flathead Oasis property, held securely within the irrevocable Martha Vance Family Trust, officially recorded years ago and completely insulated from any outside claim. Javier nodded in quiet appreciation, asking me exactly how I wanted to handle the final play. I folded my hands on the table, and told him I wanted to let the entire process proceed all the way to the formal closing table. I wanted Logan to confidently shake the buyer's hand. I wanted Tyler to stand there in his best tailored jacket. And I wanted Marcus Vance to lay out his entire leather folder of official closing documents. I paused before instructing him that once all those pieces were perfectly in place, I wanted him to execute a single phone call. Javier stared at me for a lengthy, quiet moment before remarking that I had blueprinted this entire outcome from the start. I corrected him gently, stating that I had simply drafted a blueprint for the possibility, noting there is a vast difference. He let out a genuine laugh, calling me a thoroughly formidable man, before reaching for his legal pad to structure the exact parameters of that phone call. The formal closing transaction was locked in for a Monday morning, the 3rd of December, at precisely 9 o'clock. The chosen venue was a title office called Mountain View Abstract, located in the quiet town of Deer Lodge. It was a pristine, professional environment, filled with premium coffee. The exact kind of high-end corporate space where massive sums of capital change hands, with very little public fanfare. Logan had contacted my phone twice over the course of the weekend to verify that I was still planning to attend, even going so far as to ask if I required driving coordinates to navigate to the office. The location was a straightforward 40-minute drive from my front door. He genuinely believed his old man was losing his grip, assuming I couldn't navigate a simple highway. I told him I would see him there. I pulled into the parking lot exactly 12 minutes ahead of schedule. Logan stepped through the glass doors at 3 minutes before 9, sporting his finest navy blue blazer. Tyler walked a step behind him, keeping his hands buried deep in his pockets, his eyes shifting nervously across the perimeter of the room the exact way they always did whenever he found himself trapped in an uncomfortable situation. The buyers, Harrison and Clara Marsh, were already positioned at the table, looking like perfectly pleasant, accomplished people. Harrison offered a firm, confident handshake, projecting the distinct momentum of a man who had been counting down the days to this closing for weeks. Marcus Vance sat positioned at the absolute head of the conference table, his files neatly arranged, completely efficient, and ready to finalize the deal. The presiding title officer, a woman named Sharon Jennings, had the vast stack of legal instruments perfectly sorted and stacked. I took a quiet seat in the far corner of the room, cradling my coffee mug. The moment Logan spotted my frame, the visible tightness dropped out of his shoulders, and he relaxed completely, allowing an arrogant smile to spread across his face. The look of a man who believed the victory was already secured. He marched across the room with his hand extended, greeting me loudly, stating he was glad I made it. I gripped his hand, responding quietly that I wouldn't have missed this meeting for the world, prompting him to ask if we were completely good to go. I told him we were perfectly fine, watching him retreat to his designated chair. Sharon Jennings cleared her throat to deliver the standard opening remarks. Marcus Vance uncapped his premium pen, and Harrison Marsh leaned forward, announcing he was ready to sign. Right at that exact synchronization, the silent vibration of my phone buzzed against my palm. It was a single text message from Javier Castillo, stating he was fully primed. I pushed back my chair and stood up. Every single head in that quiet conference room turned simultaneously to look at me. Sharon Jennings paused, asking if everything was all right. And I responded with the absolute calm of a quiet Sunday morning, apologizing to the room and stating there was a critical call I needed to handle. I explained that my personal attorney was on the line and desperately required a word with someone in the room, turning my eyes directly onto Marcus Vance, to specify that the call was explicitly for him. Marcus Vance blinked in utter confusion, pointing a finger at his own chest as Logan stood halfway up from his chair, demanding to know what was going on. I told Logan to sit back down, using a tone of voice so absolute and final that it left no room for argument. He sank right back into his seat. I stepped out into the quiet corridor, connected the call with Javier, and walked back into the conference room 30 seconds later to hand my device directly to the real estate agent. I watched his expression intently as Javier spoke into his ear. I saw the vibrant color drain from his face, saw his hand lower the premium pen, and witnessed the exact microsecond a professional realizes the entire multi-thousand-dollar transaction he spent weeks constructing is built on nothing but thin air. Vance uttered exactly 3 words into the receiver, asking the voice to repeat the statement. After a brief pause, he went entirely silent, handed my device back to me, and looked straight at Logan. He glanced down at the massive stack of paperwork, then over to Harrison Marsh, whose posture had shifted from eager excitement to immediate alarm. Vance cleared his throat, speaking with extreme caution as he addressed Logan directly, completely bypassing me. He announced that the closing could not proceed under any circumstances. Harrison Marsh's chair violently scraped against the floor as he stood up, demanding an explanation. The agent explained that the property title could not be legally transferred without the unanimous, verified, and documented consent of every single co-owner listed on the deed. Vance's voice remained controlled, but his jaw was visibly clenched as he admitted there was a massive structural defect in the transaction that should have been identified the exact day the property was listed for sale. In the world of legal professionals, that is the exact translation for stating that this entire disaster is completely your fault. Logan turned his head toward me slowly, moving with the heavy reluctance of a man who already knows the exact horror he is about to face. He whispered my name. I lifted my coffee mug, took a slow, unhurried sip, and let the dead silence do the heavy lifting. I asked him if he remembered what his mother used to tell me, about my habit of thinking 6 steps ahead of everyone else without ever uttering a word. I noted that she always meant it as a criticism, but as I set my mug back down on the table, it turned out to be an absolute compliment. Tyler immediately dropped his face into his open hands. Harrison Marsh frantically pulled out his phone to contact his own legal counsel. Marcus Vance stared blankly at his folder, as if the paperwork had personally betrayed him. And Logan just stared at me. My eldest son, 39 years old, trapped in his finest navy blue blazer. He whispered, asking what I had done. I let a genuine, unhurried smile spread across my face for the first time in weeks, looking at him as I stated that we hadn't even arrived at the chapter concerning Flathead Oasis yet. He had absolutely no knowledge of the lodge's existence. Nobody did. And that exact realization is where the entire foundation of their reality shifted completely. There are defining moments in a man's life that don't announce their arrival with an elegant trumpet flare or a loud warning siren. They manifest quietly, inevitably, completely decided beforehand, requiring you to do nothing but stand perfectly still and watch them unfold. This was one of those exact moments. The pristine conference room at Mountain View Abstract had transformed from a standard real estate closing into a financial crime scene in less than 4 minutes. It wasn't the kind of crime scene marked by yellow plastic tape and silver badges, but the far more devastating variety. The kind where every individual trapped in the room slowly realizes that something has gone catastrophically, irreversibly wrong, leaving only one question remaining. Who is going to be held legally accountable for the damage? Harrison Marsh was standing fully upright now, while his wife, Clara, kept a firm, restraining grip on his forearm, using that universal instinct wives possess when they are trying to prevent their husbands from uttering a statement that will inevitably end up recorded in a legal deposition. Marsh was a thoroughly disciplined man, and you could see him working incredibly hard to maintain his composure in real time. He spoke in a measured, deliberate cadence, demanding to know if the professional staff was explicitly telling him that this real estate transaction was dead in the water. Sharon Jennings looked as though she wanted to completely dissolve into the fabric of her leather office chair, stammering that a severe co-ownership title conflict had emerged. Marsh's discipline began fracturing at the edges as he reminded the room they had been locked under a binding contract for 3 consecutive weeks, had already paid out of pocket for professional structural inspections, had financed a formal property appraisal, and that his children were already celebrating the lake house with their friends. He reminded them they had driven all this way from Idaho. Marcus Vance immediately raised both hands in a defensive gesture, begging Marsh to understand his immense professional frustration, promising they would get to the absolute bottom of the issue. Marsh turned his gaze onto the agent with the cold, unblinking eyes of a man calculating a financial loss he deeply despised, stating flatly that the agent had marketed a premium property he possessed absolutely zero legal right to list. The entire room fell into a suffocating silence. Vance parted his lips to defend himself, found no words, and closed his mouth. I almost experienced a shred of pity for the professional. Almost. Logan remained completely paralyzed, frozen in his chair, staring intently at the polished wood of the table as if it might magically open up and offer him an immediate escape route. Tyler sat pinned right beside him, his hands tightly folded, staring blankly at nothing at all, wearing the exact expression of a driver who had blindly followed someone else's navigation coordinates, only to find the asphalt completely run out at the edge of a cliff. I stayed anchored in my corner, refusing to gloat or deliver a grand speech. I simply finished my coffee and waited, because this narrative was nowhere near its actual conclusion. Not by a long shot. Javier Castillo walked through the door at exactly 9:24 in the morning, having completed the drive from Helena. He was dressed in a sharp, dark, tailored suit, carrying a premium leather briefcase, and projecting the entirely unhurried confidence of a man who was standing exactly where he had planned to be all along. He extended his hand to shake mine first, then placed his briefcase flat on the polished conference table, snapped the brass latches open, and positioned 2 legal instruments side by side right in the center of the room, like a seasoned card dealer laying out the final hand. He addressed the entire room, encompassing the Marshes, Vance, Sharon Jennings, Logan, and Tyler, introducing himself clearly as my legal counsel. He announced that he intended to walk everyone through the exact legal reality of the situation, noting that absolute clarity would serve everyone far better than confusion. He tapped his index finger against the first document, identifying it as the Swan Lake deed. He explained that the title was structured as a co-ownership between Arthur Vance, Logan Vance, and Tyler Vance, legally established back in 2009. Under the strict real estate statutes of our jurisdiction, a co-owned title requires the unanimous, written authorization of every single listed party before any transfer of ownership can legally take place. He noted that this mandatory authorization was never requested from nor granted by me. Javier turned his eyes directly on to Marcus Vance, declaring flatly that the listing was completely premature, the purchase contract was entirely unenforceable, and the closing was officially terminated. The silence in the room was absolute. Harrison Marsh, to his absolute credit, looked like a man who realized he was watching a private family reckoning that had absolutely nothing to do with him. He gently pressed his wife's hand, and she nodded in agreement. Marsh composed himself, asking Javier what legitimate paths forward remained available to them. Javier gave him his undivided attention, responding with the utmost professional respect. He informed Marsh that he possessed a completely valid breach of contract claim against the listing agency, and potentially against the unauthorized sellers, meaning Logan and Tyler Vance, for executing a formal purchase agreement on a piece of real estate they lacked the unilateral legal authority to sell. He assured Marsh that all inspection fees, appraisal costs, and associated travel expenses were entirely recoverable under the law, suggesting they consult their own legal counsel, which he correctly assumed they were already doing. Marsh checked his phone, nodding a single time in agreement. Javier snapped his leather briefcase shut, terminating the discussion. Marcus Vance was the absolute first to exit the room. He refused to shake a single hand, uttering nothing on his way out except a quiet, tense instruction to Sharon Jennings about coordinating a follow-up on Tuesday morning. The heavy timber door clicked shut behind him, with the definitive sound of a professional who knew he was walking straight into a brutal disciplinary meeting with his managing broker. The Marshes exited immediately after him. Harrison paused at the threshold, turning his head back to look at me, completely ignoring Logan and Javier. He told me he was deeply sorry that I had been subjected to this situation. I nodded respectfully, telling him to enjoy whatever waterfront property they eventually settled on. A shadow of a smile crossed his face before they disappeared down the hallway. Sharon Jennings packed up her remaining files with the swift, quiet efficiency of a title officer who had witnessed real estate transactions implode before and knew that lingering in the room served no one. She vacated the space in under 3 minutes, leaving the room completely empty except for me, Javier, Logan, and Tyler. Javier looked over at me, and I offered him a sharp, subtle nod. He quietly excused himself to the corridor, pulling the door shut behind him with a soft click, demonstrating the precise instinct of a professional who knows exactly when a room needs to be left entirely alone. Logan was the first to break the silence. His voice was completely unrecognizable now. The arrogant, executive confidence had entirely drained away, leaving behind something raw, defensive, and incredibly juvenile. He looked at me, accusing me of intentionally letting the situation escalate to this exact point, letting them list the property, secure an offer, and sit down at the formal closing table. I looked back at him and confirmed that I had done exactly that. He pushed his chair back from the table, stood up, and marched over to the glass window, standing with his back completely turned to me as he stared out at the asphalt parking lot, with his hands buried deep in his pockets. He muttered that I could have intervened and stopped them at any point, that I could have easily called him after their initial Sunday conversation to state clearly that the property could not be sold without my signature. I looked at his back and repeated that I certainly could have. He spun around to face me, and I want to be incredibly precise about the expression mapped across my son's face. It wasn't merely a display of anger, and it wasn't just pure embarrassment. It was something infinitely more complex than those two emotions combined. It was the face of a man who had finally looked into a mirror and seen an ugly reality he was completely unprepared to acknowledge. He demanded to know why I chose not to stop it. I leaned forward over the table, looking him straight in the eyes, and told him that he desperately needed to see the reality of his actions, not merely hear about them. He needed to witness the consequences play out all the way to the absolute finish line. I locked my eyes onto his. I reminded him that he had gone behind his father's back to hire an agent before he ever bothered to ask for my consent. He had signed a formal listing agreement on a piece of land that had my name stamped clearly on the title. He had called my phone to hand me an artificial deadline to vacate property I built with my own 2 hands. I paused for a beat, letting the air grow thick, before asking him what exactly he expected would happen. He stood there, completely hollowed out, with absolutely no answer to give. I told him to sit back down, speaking not with malice, but with absolute finality. He sank into the nearest chair. I walked over to the head of the conference table, claiming the exact spot where the title officer had been sorting documents 20 minutes prior, and looked down at my 2 sons. Logan sat frozen in his navy blue blazer, while Tyler kept his fingers tightly interlaced, looking exactly like a man sitting in a church he no longer believed in. I deliberately took my time, letting the silence stretch, before telling them I was going to say a few things, and needed them to simply listen. Tyler offered an immediate nod, while Logan stared blankly at the polished wood before giving a slow, reluctant nod of his own. I pulled out the heavy captain's chair at the head of the table and sat down. I didn't do it out of exhaustion. I did it because I wanted to be at perfect eye level with them. I wanted us looking at each other as father and sons, not as opposing parties in a legal dispute. I told them clearly that I wasn't going anywhere, that I intended to be up at Swan Lake for every single hunting season opener until my physical body decided otherwise, and that they were both still welcome there. I made it clear that foundational truth had not changed. Tyler let out a ragged breath, the corners of his eyes visibly wet. Tyler had always been the type to feel an emotion completely before he ever spent a single second thinking through it, which was never his worst quality. Then I turned my attention back to Logan. I folded my hands flat on the table and laid out the reality of his situation. I informed him that the Marshes were going to file a lawsuit and that the claim would be targeted explicitly at him, not me. Tyler's name might get dragged into the legal filings depending on how their counsel structured the complaint, but the primary liability rested squarely on Logan's shoulders because his signature was on the listing agreement. He was the one who had shaken the agent's hand and entered into a binding purchase agreement for a property he possessed zero legal authority to sell. I paused, letting the weight settle, before revealing that Javier estimated the total cost of their legal claim, encompassing the inspection fees, the appraisal costs, travel expenses, attorney fees, and damages, would land somewhere between $18,000 and $24,000. Logan's jaw clenched so tightly the muscles visibly jumped. I told him it wasn't a life-ruining sum of money, but it certainly wasn't pocket change either. I waited in the absolute quiet until he finally forced his eyes up to meet mine. Then I dropped the heaviest truth of all. I told him that Vanessa was going to find out. The moment the name left my lips, a sharp shadow of panic flitted across his features. I noted that he had undoubtedly told her the deal was already finalized, that the $382,000 was as good as in the bank, and that she had likely already spent a massive chunk of that money inside her own head. He remained entirely mute, which was all the confirmation I needed. I told him that specific conversation was his burden to carry, that I had no intention of interfering in his marriage, but that he needed to understand that every single consequence sitting on the table in front of him bore his name alone. It didn't belong to me, and it didn't belong to his brother. It was his because he chose to move first. He chose to move fast, and he chose to execute a scheme without ever consulting the one man whose signature actually mattered on that deed. Logan's throat swallowed hard as he tried to speak, but I cut him off instantly, telling him I wasn't finished yet. He closed his mouth firmly. I shifted my gaze over to Tyler. My youngest son looked back at me, those wet eyes finally overflowing down his cheeks. I told him I was fully aware that he hadn't initiated this plot. I knew Logan had approached him with a half-formed scheme, and that he had simply drifted along with it because that was his default setting. Because the friction of a disagreement made him uncomfortable, and because Logan always treated a difference of opinion as a personal declaration of war. Tyler let out a shaky, uneven breath. But then I leaned forward, looking straight through his defenses, and reminded him that he was 36 years old, not a 9-year-old child standing in my driveway, waiting to see which direction his older brother was going to run before blindly following his lead. I told him flatly that he knew this plan was wrong, that I had heard the guilt buried in his voice during that very first phone call, and that he had chosen to proceed with the deception anyway. I told him that choice mattered deeply. Tyler looked down, whispering that he knew, that he completely understood. I leaned back into my chair, stating that if he truly understood, then what I was about to reveal next shouldn't come as a shock to either of them. I reached deep into the interior pocket of my jacket, pulled out a single, neatly folded document, and placed it flat on the conference table directly between them. I didn't unfold the document. I simply let it rest on the polished wood, watching both of their eyes lock onto it. I informed them that I had spent the entire previous morning locked in a room with Javier, rewriting the legal layout of my estate. Logan's gaze lifted with agonizing slowness, his voice barely a whisper as he questioned what specific alterations had been made. I kept my delivery completely flat and measured, informing them that when a man realizes his family is circling his life's work like vultures, he becomes incredibly deliberate about his legacy. I gestured toward the paperwork, identifying the Swan Lake property, the exact cabin they had arrogantly listed, the keys they had practically handed over to an absolute stranger without my knowledge or blessing. I revealed that the deed had been completely restructured. The title was now held solely and exclusively under my name. Every single trace of their ownership had been legally stripped away. A suffocating, dead silence blanketed the room. Tyler parted his lips to protest, but I cut him off instantly, stating that the matter was completely finalized. The updated title had already been officially processed and recorded at the county courthouse the previous afternoon. I turned my gaze directly onto Logan, reminding him that he had been so desperately impatient to liquidate the asset. But now, he was looking at a property he couldn't touch because it no longer belonged to him. It never truly had, but now the legal framework of the state matched that reality perfectly. Logan's hands slowly clenched into tight fists against the table, not an act of physical aggression, but the reflexive, painful curl of a man absorbing a blow that physically cut deep into his chest. I didn't give them a moment to recover before moving down the ledger to the Flathead Oasis Lodge, introducing the exact parameters of the Martha Vance Family Trust. I informed them that the successor beneficiary designations had been completely overwritten. I finally reached out, unfolded the crisp legal document with one hand, and slid it directly into the center of the table so they could read the text clearly without having to reach for it. I explained that Walter Briggs's daughter operated a highly respected, sprawling wilderness conservation foundation out of Bozeman. It was a phenomenal organization dedicated to purchasing and protecting working waterfront properties across the state of Montana, ensuring they remained completely wild, untouched, and fully accessible to the general public. I smoothed the document flat against the table, looking my sons dead in the eye as I delivered the final stroke. The exact moment my heart stopped beating. The entire ownership of the Flathead Oasis estate would transfer directly to that nonprofit organization. The remaining air was instantly sucked right out of the room. It didn't happen with a dramatic gasp or a loud theatrical scene. It was a slow, agonizing deflation, like a heavy tire losing its pressure over a long stretch of highway. It was the synchronized, brutal realization of two grown men discovering that the ultimate prize they had been calculating for years, the inheritance that had driven them to hire agents, sign fraudulent listings, and hand their aging father an ultimatum, was a property they would never, under any circumstances, possess. Their names would never be stamped on that title. Not now, not ever. Logan pushed away from the table, rising to his feet to march back over to the window. He assumed the exact same posture as before, staring out at the exact same vehicles in the parking lot. But the entire world outside that glass had shifted on its axis. He let out a dry, bitter scoff, repeating the word non-profit like it was an absolute joke. I confirmed his statement with a cold, solid nod. Logan spun back around to face the room, and I watched his face with extreme precision. The arrogance was entirely gone. It wasn't the fiery rage of a con man whose scheme had been exposed. It was something infinitely more exposed. It was a look I hadn't witnessed on his face since he was an insecure teenager, standing over something expensive he had shattered into pieces and couldn't fix. He stammered, claiming he never envisioned the situation would escalate to this level. I told him flatly that I knew he hadn't. He tried to defend his actions, claiming they genuinely believed they were helping me, citing the rising taxes, the physical burden of the maintenance, and the fact that I was spending my life completely isolated up there. My voice remained completely gentle, but it didn't move an inch off its foundation. I reminded him that a man who is genuinely driven by a desire to help his father asks for permission first. I told him that whatever comforting narrative he spun for his own conscience, the unvarnished truth was that he had retained an agent before he ever bothered to consult me. Tyler was weeping silently now, making absolutely no sound. Tyler never did anything loudly. 2 heavy, warm tracks of tears streamed straight down his cheeks, and he didn't even raise a hand to wipe them away. Logan looked at me, a sudden vulnerability crackling through his voice as he asked if there was anything left for them at all. He didn't ask it like an heir calculating a balance sheet. He asked it like a son who realized he had completely severed his connection to his father. For a fleeting second, he wasn't a 39-year-old corporate climber in a tailored blazer. He was a 10-year-old boy, holding a bent framing nail and covered in sawdust, looking up at me for guidance from the subfloor of an unfinished cabin. It is a terrifying thing, what the passage of time does to people. What pure greed and the frantic anxiety of missing out can do to grown men who were once just little boys handing their father tools in the summer heat. I stared at my oldest son for a long, quiet interval, and then I let out a soft laugh. It wasn't a booming display of humor, and it wasn't a cruel, mocking sound designed to humiliate a defeated adversary. It was that specific, quiet chuckle that originates deep in a man's chest and surfaces slowly. The exact laugh Martha used to say meant I possessed a piece of information that no one else in the room had figured out yet. Logan recognized the sound instantly, and the expression in his eyes shifted. Good. He needed to be paying absolute attention to what came next. I let the chuckle dissipate, allowing the room to grow completely freezing and quiet around it. Then I leaned across the table, folded my hands one last time, and spoke with an unhurried, devastating calm. I informed Logan that the Flathead Oasis property had undergone an official independent appraisal the previous month, and asked if he wanted to know the exact figure Javier's inspector had returned. He remained entirely frozen, waiting. I delivered the number like a boulder dropped into a perfectly still mountain lake. $1.1 million. I watched the ripples of that number move across both their faces, letting the massive valuation settle heavily into the silence of the room. Logan remained paralyzed at the window, while Tyler sat completely frozen at the table. I detailed the property slowly, giving every single word the space it required to breathe, describing the hidden paradise they never even knew existed, sitting 45 miles northeast of Bitterroot on a towering hill facing west, complete with that wraparound cedar porch, the Riverstone fireplace, and a mountain sunset beautiful enough to make a man believe in something real again. I paused, locking eyes with both of them, before delivering the final blow, stating flatly that the lodge was intended to be their ultimate inheritance, divided perfectly down the middle, exactly the way their mother would have wanted. The silence that followed possessed a physical weight that seemed to press the air straight out of the room. I let that $1.1 million figure sit directly alongside the $382,000 they had tried to chase at Swan Lake, forcing them to calculate the massive gulf between the two numbers. I reminded Logan that if they had succeeded, the Swan Lake sale split 2 ways would have yielded them a mere $191,000 each. I looked straight into his eyes and told him flatly that he had thrown away an absolute fortune just to lock down a fraction of the cost. Tyler let out a broken, hollow sound from the back of his throat. Not a word, just the raw noise a man makes when a blow strikes him completely off guard in a place he hadn't protected. Logan didn't make a sound at all. He just stared blankly out the glass, and I watched my oldest son finally execute the math he should have calculated long before he ever picked up his phone to involve a real estate agent. I told them gently that I hadn't hidden the existence of Flathead Oasis to penalize them, but because I desperately needed a sanctuary that belonged entirely to me, something that still carried the memory of their mother, and a place that no outsider could ever place a price tag on. I explained that my entire intention was for the property to transition to them once I was gone, but they had allowed their impatience to ruin the timeline, and in doing so, they had completely rewritten the final destination. I stood up and slowly buttoned my canvas jacket, repeating the $1.1 million valuation one final time, not to twist the blade in the wound, but to ensure the reality of the consequence was permanently burned into their minds. I told them I hoped the rush was entirely worth it. I lifted my coffee mug from the corner of the table, found the liquid completely freezing, and swallowed it anyway before sliding the updated trust documents back into my interior pocket. I looked at both of them, stating clearly that they were still my sons, a foundational truth that no legal deed or irrevocable trust could ever alter, list, or strip away at a closing table. But I maintained that their position in my life would have to be earned back from scratch. I instructed Logan to contact a defense attorney immediately, and told Tyler to head home and sit face to face with the reality of what he had allowed himself to become, warning him not to run from the discomfort. I turned on my heel and walked toward the exit. Tyler's voice cracked completely at the edges as he called out to me, uttering a desperate apology on behalf of them both. I paused at the threshold, glancing back to see Logan's shoulders drop slightly as he faced the glass. His own silent version of agreement, his own broken way of saying he was sorry. I offered a single quiet nod, telling them I knew they were, before stepping out into the corridor. Javier was waiting patiently in the hallway, leaning his frame against the wall, with his hands buried in his pockets, like a man who had absolutely nowhere more important to be. He looked up, asking how the final meeting had gone, and I told him it had played out exactly the way it needed to. We exited the corporate building together, stepping straight out into the freezing December morning air. I climbed into the cabin of my truck, sitting in the quiet for a long moment before twisting the key in the ignition. I navigated the vehicle northeast, driving past the outskirts of Seeley Lake, rolling down that familiar stretch of county road where the towering pine trees completely swallow the afternoon light. Exactly 45 miles from Bitterroot, I turned the truck down the hidden gravel path the rest of the world remained completely oblivious to, pulling to a stop in front of the Flathead Oasis Lodge, just as the final golden rays of the winter sun broke flat across the surface of the water. I took a seat on the western-facing deck, completely alone with the water and the exact brand of profound quiet that costs absolutely nothing but means absolutely everything. I looked out at the ripples, thinking of Martha, knowing she would have possessed plenty to say about the entire day's events. She would have shaken her head at Logan's arrogance, wept for Tyler's broken spirit, and likely told me I was far too calculating for my own good before smiling and handing me a homemade sandwich. I poured a slow drink into a glass, raised it high toward the water, and stated aloud to the empty air that the place belonged completely to her, and always had. The lake held its ground in response, completely unhurried, calm, and settled, matching the exact disposition of the man who had bought it. The Swan Lake cabin still stands strong off State Route 12, exactly 20 miles northwest of Bitterroot, but the deed carries one single name now, completely mine, the exact way the title should have read from the very beginning. Logan contacted Javier 3 days after the disaster to coordinate the fallout with the Marsh family, eventually settling the structural breach claim for a firm $21,000 out of his own pocket. Vanessa did not handle the financial loss well, but they are currently forcing their way through the strain, which is far more than I anticipated and precisely the reality he deserves to navigate. Tyler contacted my line the following Sunday afternoon just to talk, bringing no hidden agenda, no financial angle, and no rehearsed speech. Just 40 minutes of the exact, honest conversation we used to share before the prospect of money poisoned the well. It was a genuine start. Marcus Vance received a formal administrative complaint filed directly against his professional real estate license with the state licensing board. I didn't have to lift a finger to initiate it, as the Marshes handled the paperwork themselves. Some consequences possess a natural momentum and require absolutely zero assistance to reach their destination. Meanwhile, the Flathead Oasis Lodge remains firmly anchored exactly where it was built, perched high on the hill, facing the western horizon, locked safely inside a trust that no greedy hand can ever compromise. Once my time on this earth is finished, it will transition to individuals who will truly appreciate the land. Walter Briggs made the drive up to join me for a weekend later that December. We sat side by side on the cedar deck, watching the first sheets of winter ice begin to crystallize at the edges of Flathead Oasis, remaining completely silent for hours at a time. That is the ultimate truth concerning genuine friends, sacred spaces, and a life constructed with deliberate intent and protected with absolute ferocity. They don't require a massive abundance of words. They simply need to endure. If you found this story powerful, make sure to hit that like button and drop a comment below letting me know your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of justice and hard-learned lessons. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next one.